Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I noted last week the Republican leader came to his desk and he spoke about the budget, and he described our Democratic budget as a left-wing manifesto. Left-wing manifesto. We have done $1.8 trillion in spending cuts already. We raised $600 billion, a third of that, in revenue by restoring the Clinton-era tax rates for families earning over $450,000 a year. So in the balance between spending cuts and new revenues, it's already 3-to-1 in favor of spending cuts. And in our budget, we propose to fill the gap of the remainder with 50% spending cuts and 50% revenue. And that's a left-wing manifesto. The Republican budget changes Medicare into a voucher program. The Republican budget cuts non-defense discretionary spending to levels lower than at any time since OMB started keeping track a half a century ago. The Republican budget would set annual domestic spending at rates lower than 1962, when there were no Pell Grants at all, when 30% of American seniors lived in poverty. But that's not extreme. A Democratic budget that is 50-50 spending cuts and revenues, that's a left-wing manifesto. The Democratic budget has $975 billion in new spending cuts, and it has $975 billion in new revenue in order to close that budget gap 50-50. That means, including the deficit reduction that we've already done, this, of $1.8 trillion, we will be in total at $4.3 trillion in deficit reduction, which is probably just a little bit over the target that most of the experts have given us to hit. And about $2.8 trillion of that, of the 4.3, will come in spending cuts. $600 billion has come in new tax revenue, and $975 billion will come from loopholes, for a total of $1.6 trillion coming from new revenues. Some left-wing manifesto, $1 trillion more in spending cuts than revenue, at a time when billionaires in America are paying lower tax rates than brick masons. If that's a left-wing manifesto, then the left wing needs to fire its manifesto writers. Left-wing manifesto. That's some pretty high rhetoric. We know where the word manifesto comes from, of course. It comes from the Cold War and the communists. 50% spending cuts, 50% revenue, and the hint is, the rhetorical hint, is that we Democrats with our budget are a bunch of commies. That is high rhetoric indeed, and it's not coming from some fringe senator in their rank and file. This is the Republican leader of the United States Senate. Left-wing manifesto. In the face of the obvious facts of the balance of our budget, why might the rhetoric be getting so high? What might the Republicans be getting so touchy about? Well, let's look at where we get the rest of our revenue for our 50-50 budget. We got the first 600 from restoring the Clinton-era tax rates, a time of huge economic success for our country, for folks over $450,000 in income. Where do we get our $975 billion in new revenue? Well, we go to the Republican treasure trove. We go to Alibaba's cave for corporations and the rich. We go to the tax earmarks and the special deals that special interests have year after year squirreled away in the tax code. Now, people think, how much can that be? What can it mean when we have money going through the tax code and out, but not coming to the government in revenues? Well, what is in Alibaba's cave? How big is the treasure trove? Have a look. This is the amount of money that the United States government collects from individuals in taxes. 1.09 trillion. Here's how much goes back out the back door of the tax code to people who've got loopholes, special rates, deductions in the tax code that help them. 1.02 trillion. Virtually the same. For every dollar of revenues the United States collects in actual revenues from individual taxpayers every year, another 94 cents goes back out through the loopholes and the deductions and the special rates. A grand total every year of more than $1 trillion. And since we budget over a 10-year period, it's $10 trillion in this budget period. $10 trillion. On the corporate side, for every dollar of revenues the United States collects in actual revenues from corporations, another 87 cents goes back out the back door of the tax code through loopholes and special rates and deductions. And again, because we do this over, every year, $157 billion. And again, because we do this over 10 years, that's more than $1.5 trillion. If you add these two together, it's more than $11.5 trillion in the budget period. If you presume some modest growth in the economy over those 10 years, that number gets to about $14 trillion. So, Alibaba's tax code cave of tax spending is very big. There is lots of treasure squirreled away in it. And that doesn't even count the billions of dollars that corporations and wealthy tax avoiders hide offshore. So it never even gets into the tax equation. The IRS has pegged that recently at about $385 billion a year. There's one little building in the Cayman Islands that Chairman Conrad used to refer to regularly when he was chairman of the Budget Committee. One little building in the Cayman Islands, maybe 5 stories tall, where over 18,000 companies claim to be doing business. You can imagine what kind of business they're doing there. That's how $385 billion a year never even appears in the tax equation. So this spending that gets done through the tax code, that doesn't get reviewed by annual appropriations, that gets squirreled away in there and it's there to stay, it's a big treasure trove indeed. Not counting offshoring, probably $14 trillion in a 10-year budget period. For those who are clever and connected enough to get their special deals, their tax earmarks, into the tax code. We take out of that, call it 14 trillion, at a minimum 11.5 trillion, 975 billion, about 7%. That's how much of it, this little red slice, is what we take to balance the budget for deficit reduction. The problem is, the Republicans don't want us to look into their treasure trove. Alibaba's cave of tax tricks is where the juicy earmarks are for special interests. Want to know why Mitt Romney had to fiddle his taxes to get up to a 14% tax rate? Which, by the way, is a lower tax rate than a solitary hospital orderly pays walking down the halls of Rhode Island Hospital at night. How does he get it? So he has to fiddle his taxes to get up to a rate lower than a hospital orderly pays? How do Romney and the hedge fund billionaires pull that trick off? Look here in Alibaba's cave for the carried interest exception. Do you want to know where ExxonMobil, which is the richest and most profitable corporation in the history of the world, where ExxonMobil gets its hands into the American taxpayers' pockets? Look at the big oil subsidies in Alibaba's cave. Want to know how corporate jets get special favored tax treatment compared to the commercial jets that ordinary mortals fly? Look at the accelerated depreciation schedules in Alibaba's cave of tax tricks. If using the phrase left-wing manifesto seems a little strident, a little exaggerated about a budget proposal for 50% spending cuts and 50% revenues, and you want to inquire why, look no farther than the Republican treasure trove of corporate and special interest tax earmarks heaped up in Alibaba's cave. Well, we're knocking at the door. We are knocking on the door of Alibaba's cave, which so far has been untouched. We've done all spending cuts and a little bit of tax rate increase for families over $450,000 back to the Clinton-era rates. We haven't touched yet Alibaba's cave. What we're saying as Democrats is that Americans paid in deficit reduction spending cuts, that they're going to lose in services and in benefits, $1.8 trillion. And they will pay in another $975 billion in cuts under our Democratic proposal. We're saying that folks over $450,000 a year income saw their tax rates go up to Clinton-era levels, and they're paying in another $600 billion in deficit reduction. And now we want to go into Alibaba's cave of tax earmarks. And out of at least $11.5 trillion, probably more like $14 trillion, and if you throw in the offshoring, that takes you up to $17, $18 trillion. We want to take less than $1 trillion out over 10 years to help reduce our budget deficit. So the Republicans are getting anxious. The alarms are ringing in the special interests, and the Republicans are rushing to the trenches to defend their special interests and their cherished tax earmarks. And the best defense being a good offense, that is how a balanced deficit reduction plan that in sum has $1 trillion more in spending cuts than in revenues, suddenly becomes a leftist manifesto. If you listen, we just had the hearings in the Budget Committee on our budget. If you listened in that committee, the Republicans said it plainly. They didn't mince words. Not a penny of tax loopholes, not a penny from Alibaba's cave of tax treasures can go for deficit reduction. Not a penny. That's their rule. They will say that they're willing to move the treasure around a little bit in Alibaba's cave, so long as it all gets used for corporations and the wealthy. Again, that's not a guess. That's in the Republican budget. None of the goodies squirreled away by the special interests over the years in Alibaba's cave for deficit reduction. None. All of it to lower tax rates for corporations and the rich, the ones who mostly benefit from the treasure in Alibaba's cave to begin with. They're willing to spread the treasure around a little as long as it stays in the hands of big corporations and the rich. Well, we are at the gates of Alibaba's cave, this treasure trove of tax code special deals and earmarks for the rich and the well-connected. We are at the place where the lobbyists wheel the sweet corporate tax deals. We're knocking on the door of the $14 trillion tax spending area that has been so far left completely untouched in deficit reduction. And so our Republican friends are getting a little twitchy. Come on, fellas. Out of nearly $14 trillion in tax spending and earmarks, can't we just put a little bit towards the deficit? Just 7%? Under their own budget, they take 41% of it and give it back in the form of lower high-end tax rates, lowered rates for big corporations and the rich. Can't we do just 7% for deficit reduction? I thought the deficit was so important, but maybe not when it comes to our friends protecting the interests of the big corporations and the rich. I thank the presiding officer, and I yield the floor.